Well, another bank that's grabbing headlines is Arab Bank, one of the largest financial lenders in the Middle East. And it's on trial here in the U.S. It's being accused of helping to finance terrorist attacks and suicide bombings by dealing with the finances of terrorist group Hamas, the Palestinian Islamist militant group. What's going on there? This is quite a landmark development.
It is a landmark development, and it's a very fascinating case, Michelle. This trial has been 10 years in the making. So back in 2004, a group of approximately 300 Americans, most of them who were Israelis or have Israeli backgrounds, but were American nationals nonetheless, filed a case against Arab Bank, saying that Arab Bank essentially helped with financial transactions and wire transactions to the Islamic militant group Hamas, and then Hamas subsequently used that money to carry out sophisticated attacks as well as suicide bombings that ended up resulting in the deaths and injuries of many Americans and their families.
Nearly 300 plaintiffs claim Arab Bank knowingly provided financial services to the military wing of the Palestinian Islamist group Hamas. It's a claim the defense denies, saying payments to Hamas were made in error. Mark Werbner is an attorney representing some of the plaintiffs. He says Arab Bank helped Hamas during the Second Intifada, also known as the uprising in the early 2000s.
Families whose loved ones were killed by terrorists in Israel during the Intifada, that period of violence from 2000 to 2004. And their basis for this is to show that Arab Bank was providing financial services to Hamas during that period, and that the bank knew they were providing services to Hamas involving millions and millions of dollars.
It's the first U.S. civil suit filed under the Anti-Terrorism Act, passed in 1990, which allows victims of international terrorism to seek compensation in U.S. courts. The plaintiffs' lawyers allege that Arab Bank knowingly allowed the Saudi Committee, a charity established by the Saudi government to help Palestinians, to transfer $35 million to known terrorists and their families as payments for suicide bombings during the Second Intifada, thereby facilitating terrorist activities.
Arab Bank had a location in Manhattan, Madison Avenue and 52nd Street. It was a key part of the scheme by which they converted money that had been raised in Saudi Arabia to U.S. dollars and then wired that money through their New York branch to Israel and the West Bank so that it could be distributed to people that we say were involved in suicide bombing attacks.
Lawyers for the plaintiffs say that Arab Bank engaged in willful blindness, which essentially means turning a blind eye towards illegal and criminal banking activities.
Lawyers for Arab Bank refused to comment on camera, but Arab Bank did release a statement saying it provided routine financial services to Palestinian charities. The bank said, quote, Arab Bank processed the Saudi Committee transfers with the understanding that they were intended to alleviate a humanitarian crisis in the Palestinian territories, and not, as the lawsuits allege, to incentivize Palestinians to commit terrorist attacks.
It's also important to note that putting together a jury for this case was an extremely tedious and an intense process. Michelle, people from all over New York as well as Brooklyn applied to be on that jury panel. They had to undergo this 20-page form with 200 questions so that the judges could see whether or not they were relatively objective in this situation.
And in trying to maintain objectivity, I believe that they didn't have any Jewish or Muslim people allowed on the jury to keep it religiously neutral.
That's absolutely right. So as you can imagine, this is a very politically charged, a very religiously charged, religious charged situation. We're talking about Israel versus Hamas. Is that quite
common where you would rule out a jury based on religion?
Not really. We rarely see such trials come to U.S. courts. So I guess the judge, in order to keep this as neutral as possible, decided that no Jews or Muslims were allowed on that 11-member jury panel.
Well, as this trial progresses, a lot of other financial institutions around the world are watching this because it could have impact on those banks and other institutions that do play a role in financing groups that are linked to terrorist attacks. So
That's absolutely right.
What could the long-term impact be?
Well, that's actually a really good point that you bring up, because there are a lot of international banks that operate in the Middle East, and there are a lot of financial executives that are probably wobbling or uncomfortable in their chair, frayed nerves, that have operations in the Middle East, because essentially what this means is this has opened up the Middle Eastern banking infrastructure to more scrutiny. So banks are now looking at this, taking a step back and assessing risk versus reward. You know, does us having a subsidiary or having a presence in the Middle East pose as a liability? What is the risk? What is the chance of us being exposed under scrutiny? Because truth be told, Michelle, you as a banking executive could undergo and follow the laws and do all the right things, but you never really know what your client is going to do.
Right.
So another really interesting thing about this case is that one banking expert I spoke to said that the stakes are very high, that if the plaintiffs, if these 300-odd Americans with Israeli backgrounds do end up winning and can prove that Arab Bank was guilty.
What kind of damages could they get then?
Well, we could see a really wide-scale retrenchment of banks across the Middle East, Michelle.
Well, you mentioned the banking, and we saw very recently how BNP Paribas was in a lot of trouble for not abiding by the sanctions and was providing financial services to Iran.
Over $3 billion in fines they had to pay.
So a lot at stake here. Thanks so much. Tracy Tandon live with us in the studio.